Hi there, this is Michael Reed, the host of the podcast. The following episode has some audio discrepancies, primarily on my side due to echoing effects, as it was early on in the production and I didn't have the proper audio and visual capture set up doing exactly correctly yet. I still wanted to post the episode anyway because I feel the conversation was a really good conversation to be had and should be listened to and talked about. Just giving you a heads up, there may be some errors and this will not be something that continues into the future. I do hope you enjoyed this episode.
We need to understand that mental health is about more than just, psychiatric disorders, so to speak. I mean, it includes things like parenting and communication and problem-solving skills and conflict resolution. And we need to be teaching these to kids.
Welcome to Rebuilding the Village, a podcast that seeks to explore the causes of modern problems by examining the roots of our metaphorical village through the systems and structures in society that may have been disrupted in the technological and industrial era that we inhabit. Thank you for joining me today.
So let's start off. You've been doing social work for a little over 30 years now?
Mm-hmm.
Where did you
Yes,
start?
that's
What got you
correct.
into it?
What got me into it? It's funny. It was a journey. I started out actually as a theater major at New York University, and then I took Psychology 101 and fell in love with it, and so I got my bachelor's in psychology. But then I became really interested in politics. And so between getting my bachelor's and my master's, I took some time off and I worked on the Hill and took a couple of other legislative positions. And I then missed the clinical part. And so social work is the only mental health profession that combines, policy, is just as interested in policy as it is in the clinical side of things. So that's how I ended up in social work as opposed to like psychology, because that was my original goal, was to major in psychology and get my PhD.
Okay, and you've been working in a variety of fields, it looks like. And the biggest one that stuck out to me is the military. Because maybe I'm just the average person, but when I think of social work, military is like lower on the list of what I think of. What was the actual application of that line of work?
Right. Yeah, it's actually, they have behavioral health officers, and that's particularly in the Army. I don't know that they have that in the Navy or the Marines, but they do have it in the Army, and they do have it in the Air Force. And so what we do is depends on where we are. And fortunately, unlike some MOSs, as they call them, there's not a whole lot to do in garrison, right? You do a lot of training, but you don't really get to do your job until you deploy. Whereas with social workers, when we're in garrison, we work out of a clinic or a hospital and we handle domestic violence cases. So they call it family advocacy program. And so that's largely what I did. I also ran an anger management group for soldiers. And so then when I deployed, first of all, I worked out of a hospital and then an outpatient clinic seeing soldiers, basically as I do at home, just one-on-one individual therapy. And then I moved from Kandahar Airfield to Bagram Airfield, where I used more of my social work skills. I was the executive officer, XO as they call it, for Medical Command for all of Afghanistan. So it's XO for MedCom, is what they call it. And that was a really rewarding experience.
So now, my first thought would be that when you have new recruits coming in, a lot of them are having to learn how to then cooperate and work with other people that maybe they didn't have this kind of experience before in their own homes, their family lives, and things like that. Or is it more so problems who tend to arise more out of environmental circumstance? Like these guys were pretty good back at home, but once they're in a brand new country, specifically Afghanistan, there would be these new problems that arise because they're stressed out, they're in a new environment, they don't really know the language, they don't know the people, and all of a sudden anger is starting to rise up and frustration is starting to rise up, and now it's causing problems in the units and things like that. Which would you say was like
Right.
the direction things would be? Where would the problems generally come from in these environments?
Right. Most soldiers, they go into the military knowing what they're getting into, right? So the culture is defined by the military and the unit that they're in. And when they deploy, actually, most enjoy deployment because they get to focus on their profession, their goal, whatever that might be. So it's kind of the opposite of what people expect. Like I said, a lot of soldiers don't get to practice what they train until they're actually deployed. And all you do is focus on the mission. You don't have to focus on anything else. There's no other responsibilities or distractions. So, in that respect, a lot of soldiers actually enjoy deployment. Where we get into problems is twofold. One is obviously combat. And so I saw a lot of soldiers that, had some combat related trauma. And then the other one is family issues, either just problems at home. And, I don't know, maybe this is stereotyping, but I think men in particular, they say men are from Mars, women are from Venus, right? So men are fixers. And when they hear about problems at home, they want to fix it. And so it's very frustrating for them, to not be home in order to help. And so it was really interesting because the longer the deployment, the more you see an increase in soldiers coming in talking about family issues. And then sometimes it's about finances, related to the family. But those are largely what we see.
Yeah, I was actually looking through some of your old blog posts, and I had to pull the line out I really liked. It was anger is a very empowering emotion. It can motivate people to do things they normally wouldn't, but it's also the tip of the iceberg, a byproduct of other feelings such as hopelessness, disappointment, frustration, fear, etc. I imagine in this case, from what I've heard, especially my own experience, but also most people I've talked to experience, is that a lot of guys tend to shift towards anger as like a default emotion for a lot of problems in their lives. But the problem tends to be that they don't then address the underlying sublimated emotion in the problem itself.
Right.
I imagine you must have seen a lot of that in the military, but also in your personal practice. What has been your experience so far working with men in particular in that regard?
Absolutely. Although lately, what we've also seen is an increase in suicide. And that's true in also like first responders, like police officers too. There's been an increase. But there's also been an increase in domestic violence among police officers. Last I read, it was like 15% higher than the national average. So the one thing that's different is when man attempts suicide, he is often, I hate to use this word, but successful at it. Mm-hmm. In other words, men tend to use more lethal means when they try to kill themselves than women do. So women attempt it more, but men commit it more. And so as far as anger goes, yes, if it's externalized, then you often see it in terms of domestic violence. If it's internalized, then it'll often be in terms of something self-destructive like suicide, or it could be substance abuse, right? Alcohol or is more likely because it's very much more a part of the culture, military culture. As far as anger in general, the reason why I say that is because we see so much anger right now in our society, which I know is, the topic of your podcast. And so what happens is that we say that anger is the tip of the iceberg. And so that's the part that everybody sees. But under the iceberg are all these other underlying feelings, right? Hurt, shame, frustration, depression, and a lot of trauma. And so if people don't deal with that, then they're going to turn it outward or turn it inward, right? And so we see a lot of anger, people turning those underlying feelings outward. And so, and one of the reasons why that happens is because, like I said, anger is it's an immediate response of all the emotions that we have, right? Anger is there to protect us. It's an immediate response. And so because of that, it's the most impulsive, but it's also the most energizing because we need that energy, right? Evolutionarily speaking, right? We needed that to protect ourselves. And actually that part of the brain is very primitive, right? The part of the brain that where we have emotions is very primitive. And so people act on that anger because it's impulsive and it's so energizing. But underneath it all, there are a lot of other issues. Well, I always say that violence and bigotry and greed are just quote unquote solutions for people that lack emotional insight and problem solving skills. Or coping skills.
I heard a really good take on this in another podcast was talking about how you'd feel these emotions maybe in your day to day, but there was more than enough time to decompress from it, to let it resolve, let it kind of digest. And nowadays, I think what the problem is, you don't get a break. Somebody pissed you off and you're right after the next thing. You don't have no time to sit down and think about what happened and just really like, guy cuts you off in traffic. You're like, oh, and then 10 minutes later, you're driving, you're just cruising, you're getting hypnotized by the road. And you're like, whatever, that guy's an idiot. I'm never going to see him again. No big deal. But now it just kind of compounds. Or social media is a big one where basically if something happens to you or something screws up, it just echoes into infinity and you never get a chance to breathe from it before the next thing comes along.
Yep. That's a really good point because what happens is that when we're in emotion mind, right, the emotions come from a different part of the brain than reason and emotional regulation, right, problem solving, thinking about consequences, using your judgment. And so in order for someone to use reason and so to be able to reason with that person, you have to get them out of emotion mind first. And because there's all of these provocations all the time, people stay in anger mode. They never get out of anger mode, and therefore they never use that prefrontal cortex, those other skills that you need to manage those emotions. So we were talking about, impulsivity, right? So now that we have social media, if somebody feels something, they can get right on social media and they can express it, right? There's nothing forcing them to calm down, right? To like you said, to reflect. And I think that that's why a lot of social media has become a venue for anger, for expressing anger more than anything. And we know, and politicians know, that anger is energizing. And in fact, it's supposed to be energizing, but you're supposed to redirect it to something constructive, right? Not something destructive. And so, it wasn't, for example, until Roe v. Wade was overturned that you saw a lot of women all suddenly, energized to speak up about it and to advocate for it. And so that's a really good example of just how human nature is.
Especially when you mentioned the suicide rate. You mentioned earlier about the male suicide rate is higher because of more success. But what I've done a little research and I've been seeing, I think it's since 2000. Around the time that the smartphones really became prominent, the rate of suicide in younger adults, even some like early, if not pre-teens, has been skyrocketing. I don't know if you have any experience with that.
Between the ages of 10 and 24, it's gone up quite a bit, yeah, which is sad. I mean, a 10-year-old or someone who's just a kid, it's all sad, but actually,
yeah, in that regard, I think it's a problem that, like I said, the anger thing before, we don't have time to decompress, we don't have a break, we don't have the kind of like people are surrounded by. And I think even with social media, even a step beyond social media, it's this idea that we are ridiculously interconnected with everyone else. We have a lot of superficial relationships and not a lot of depth in those relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is
Right.
a major part of the problem that you're seeing, where especially like from my own perspective, like young men not being emotionally vulnerable. Why? Because everyone online says if a guy's cried, then you're less of a man. If you have embarrassment or shame, you're less of a man. So I gotta just bottle it up forever. When in reality, if you had a couple of close, really tight friends and they really cared about you, and you came up to them one day and said like, "Listen, bro, my girlfriend just broke up with me. I just lost my job. My cat just ran away. Something terrible just happened. I need to just sit down and vent. Do you mind listening?" And it's different to say to somebody, to say to social media, like, "Oh my God, this thing happened right now." You got 100 people saying, "Oh my God, I feel so sorry, sending thoughts and prayers," versus someone actually sitting there next to you, listening to you talk, listening to you vent, and the difference it has neurologically in you learning to digest that emotion.
Right. I'm glad you brought up the neurology, because I was going to bring that up too, the neurobiology, because our brains have not evolved as fast as our technology has. So our brains are still very dependent upon connection in order to learn, and in order to, most of our brain is dependent on connection in terms of activity, activation. And so there are a lot of parts of our brain that aren't being activated, we're not using when we're interacting, even if we're interacting electronically. You just think about it. There's no use of depth perception. There's no use of touch and smell, and just all these different parts of our brain that aren't getting activated. I talked to a neuroscientist about this, and he said they're starting to see atrophy more and more because of it. And, the more you learn about neurobiology, the more you understand about what's happening. Another thing is, he talked about learning and how we learn, and we are again dependent upon, like, reading a book, physically reading a book. We take into consideration, spatial recognition, like where something is on a page and when we turn the page. We also rely on our mood. So people only learn when they're in a good mood. That's what activates the memory neurons, is when we're happy. And so if people are not happy, then they're not going to be learning very well. And we only learn from people that we trust. And so if we don't trust somebody, we're not going to learn from them. And so, there's all of these different factors that are going into play here as far as why, as far as the lack of connection and how it's impacting us and our society.
Yeah, and I know on your podcast you have done a few segments on parenting 101, which brings up the topic of kids, and
Yeah.
that's becoming a major topic I'd love to try and divulge into pretty heavily, is this deconstruction of just like these typical systems that were in place for a long time that we weren't even aware that they were doing what they were doing in the first place, in terms of being around your parents, being around adults, being around family members on a regular basis. And now we're stepping into this world where we're so ridiculously physically disconnected from our own family members, and the kids are starting to really suffer. Have you noticed something particular? What is your take on what's happened with parenting in the last 50 or so years?
Well, I've been practicing for 30 years. I don't know that I've seen a difference in parenting, except that I think it's harder because of technology. The things that I'm seeing parents have to deal with today that just would have been unheard of. And then there's also the dangers. The more you see more weapons in school, more mass shootings, those sorts of things that was just been unheard of, when I was growing up. I'm 58 years old. So, the most I remember is, somebody pulling an fire alarm. That was as bad as it got. But and then there's just so many stories I could share with you about the dilemmas that people get in because of the internet. But it really touches on a bigger issue, which is why mental health is so important why psychology and understanding human behavior is so important. This is not stuff that you're born with. You have to learn it. So like, for example, the stuff that I cover in my Parenting 101, which was supposed to be one episode, but like you said, I mean, I started talking about it and I realized we're going to need more time. So I ended up being 3 episodes. But all of that, I don't expect parents to know that stuff. They have to learn it. And we don't talk about mental health, so they don't learn it. What another, though, trend that I've been seeing is when I bring up mental health, like to parents and just public in general, people are so much more supportive. And go, yes, we need mental health in the school systems. Yes, we need to address mental health more. They're all seeing it. They're seeing it in their kids and they're seeing it in public. And that was something that I would not have expected even 10 years ago. So we need to understand that mental health is about more than just psychiatric disorders, so to speak. I mean, it includes things like parenting and communication and problem-solving skills and conflict resolution. And we need to be teaching these to kids.
Yeah, I think with the kids in particular, I had a conversation with my father about 3 weeks ago, and I was somewhere in the conversation talking about parenting, and I remember him saying something to the effect of like, when it comes to raising kids, you're just kind of figuring it out as you go. Which I forget if I really pushed back on that point, but to me, I kind of came to this realization of like, how did we survive as a species? If every generation was having to relearn it all from day one, which means there had to have been some form of intergenerational wisdom along the way that's starting to be lost in favor of things like Google, where it's like, you have a problem, just Google it, which is not the worst thing. Sometimes it's like, okay, I need to fix something in my house, like my sink has a problem. There's plenty of videos on plumbing, okay, and generally speaking, it's like, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, okay, they're all going to say the same thing. But then when it comes to something like, I have a problematic child who's got, attention-focusing issues, and I also work, 2 jobs, and I barely have time to focus on them, and they're not doing well in school, what's the answer, Google? And it's like, there's no way to answer that specifically, because it's such a unique situation for everybody. And therein lies this problem, I think, with where you're not going to have the exact playbook. Every kid's going to be unique, even between like multi-generationally. Every kid's going to be completely unique from the next one. But there's a lot of lost knowledge, I think, going on in the form of like what it, like you said, with behavior, understanding human behavior. Like, why are my kids doing this? Like, I was told if I was, the kid should be 2 years old and should be learning listening right now. Well, the kid's different. The kids could be excelling. They could be taking a little time more to mature. And a lot of this is now getting a lot of. I think in a way it's becoming they're trying to reduce it to simplicity, whereas it's a complex phenomenon. It's kid by kid. And again, a lot of different opinions depending on who you ask. That's a big one I noticed. It's just like, if you ask a more conservative parent, it's like, just beat them up until they listen. If you ask them like liberal parent, might be like, well, let's talk about their feelings. Like, well, maybe it's somewhere in the middle. I can tell like a good example of like me personally. When I was growing up, my parents gave me even something close to a side eye. I was like, I'm done. I quit. You win. I'm sorry. My sister though was like, I will fight you all without hesitation.
Yeah.
And she was just she needed a different form of parenting than I did.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's part of being a parent is adjusting, your interventions according to the child that you're dealing with. No 2 children are going to be the same. I think it gets back to the fact that there are just so many more challenges now than there were before. And you talk about tradition. I mean, there's some who would argue that we need to go back to the nuclear family, and then that's where all of the breakdown has started. I think that there's just so many more demands on our time, like you said, than there used to be. What was supposed to happen, right, is that technology was supposed to make our lives easier, and in some respects it has, but it also has made our lives busier. Right. We're just expected to be accessible now that we have these phones. How can it be that I can't reach them wherever they are? Right. And so I thought it was really interesting, like when COVID happened, because so many people realized how unbalanced their lives were. And a lot of people left their jobs and found jobs where they could work from home if the job didn't allow them to. And so many employees are pushing back when they're being pushed to go back into the office, even 2 days a week. And, I just kept thinking to myself, we could have told you this a long time ago. We didn't need a pandemic to tell you that your life is unbalanced. And that gets into a whole nother topic about feelings and why we have feelings, because they are what we have feelings in order to achieve balance. And so it's just about learning how to, I think, adapt to the modern era that we're in. And we're not going to go back. So it's about learning to adapt. The thing that hasn't changed, right, is us as human beings, right? Essentially, we're the same people, right? And so that's what I try to teach people is, I call it embracing your humanity, is learning how to use your innate skills to achieve well-being. And so, for example, with feelings, I always say, if you touch a hot stove, you're going to burn your hand. It's going to hurt, right? You're going to feel pain in your hand. If you don't eat for days, you're going to be hungry. And there's a reason for that. That's your body's way of telling you, that there's a need or a threat, right? That you're overlooking, right? So we have feelings for the same reason. They are a survival mechanism to ensure that we don't overlook any needs or threats in our lives. And so what we end up doing is most people try to talk themselves out of their emotions, or they ignore them, right? They use that prefrontal cortex. They go right to prefrontal cortex and skip over the limbic system. The emotion itself is trying to tell you something. Remember where it comes from. It's a reaction to something in your environment. And so what I teach people to do is to identify the feeling first. And we call this emotional intelligence. And then identify specifically where it's coming from, not generally, but specifically. Like, I'm afraid of failing this test. Well, how would you fail the test? I'm afraid I won't understand the questions, or I'm afraid I'm going to have a panic attack in the middle of the test, or I'm afraid I'm just going to forget everything that I learned. Those are all 3 things that I've heard from students. And so once you specify, then you can problem solve. Well, what specifically is in my control to prevent the thing that I'm afraid of, or the thing that I'm overwhelmed by, right? Or whatever the feeling may be.
Yeah, I've come across this topic. It's helped a lot with me, and I've been trying to work with people I know as well. This concept of locus of control.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding what can you actually control, what can't you control, and focus on what you can, and don't worry about what you can't. You can't control the driver in the next lane who's honking his horn at you, but you can control you not smashing into his car in a fit of rage, trying to get him off the road.
Mm-hmm.
But I do notice, I guess maybe it's a built-in function of being a human being that you mentioned before about human behavior and understanding it. That I think there's a bit of a strong. It may be ego. I suspect it's just ego in thinking like, I should be above this. I should be able to just control all my feelings and my thoughts. And the perfect example of this, I've told some people, I usually charge my cell phone in the kitchen and I sleep in the bedroom. So I don't have it anywhere near me while I'm sleeping because I cannot stop myself. And it was like 3 weeks ago. I had a random thought. I ran over. I was like, I gotta Google this one thing. I want to know the answer to this question. Suddenly, it's like, oh, here's a YouTube video. Watch the YouTube video about this thing. Oh, cool. I'll watch it. It's 10:30 at night. I blink. Suddenly, it's 1 o'clock in the morning because I've been scrolling through YouTube videos. Like, I just had. And for a brief second, I was like, why can't I just get myself to stop this? And then I thought about it. I was like, these technology companies have spent billions of dollars trying to make this the most addictive thing on the planet. Who am I to say that I should be able to just willpower this on a whim that's just not fun? Like, that's a separate part of your brain, an addiction, a temptation. So rather than beat myself up and go, oh, this is wrong with me, I'm such a bad person, go like, no. This is just what it does. The best thing you can do is get out of your room and just go back to sleep and just acknowledge the fact. It's kind of like the way I tell to people is like, if you're a recovering alcoholic, you may never be allowed to go to a bar ever again. And that's just your life now. And that's fine. Because it's not your fault. It's just that there's a part of your brain that can override your executive thinking that you don't have control over, that can just send you into a tailwind of addiction again, that you have to just stay clear of. But you're not a bad person for having that problem or having those feelings, those emotions. That's a different part of you. And you're not a bad person for not being able to brute force overcome them, so to speak.
Oh, wow. I mean, what you just said touches on so many different things that I could talk about. I'll start with the first one, which was control. So a lot of times what people associate with control is external things, right? And I actually have identified 3 different categories that are in our control, right? The first one is external, changing something about a situation. The second one is not putting yourself in under unnecessary stressful situations. And then the third one is how you cope cognitively, emotionally, and behaviorally. So the first one is the one that people rely on the most, but it's the one that's the least in our control, changing something about a situation or a person, right? And that's what people tend to think of when they think of control. And I have, patients come to me and, I'll ask them what's in their control, and they say, oh, there's nothing in my control. And then by the time, I've stopped working with them, they're like, I've learned there's a lot of things that are in my control, right? So the second category, which is avoiding unnecessary stress, really what that comes down to is learning how to set boundaries and assert yourself in situations. But the third one is about coping skills. And one of the things that I say is we don't have a crystal ball, but what we can have is a toolbox full of coping skills to take with us wherever we go. And so what I find is a lot of people, a lot of where their anxiety comes from and where that worrying comes from and that negative thinking comes from is not trusting themselves, right? That they will be able to handle uncertainty. Well, uncertainty is a part of life. We can't avoid it, right? We can't control every outcome. We can't predict every outcome, and we can't control every variable. So what you do instead is you arm yourself with as many tools in your toolbox as you possibly can. It's like the difference between, walking out of your house and going hiking with just, flip-flops, t-shirt and shorts, and, having all the camping gear that you could possibly need, right? And that's what a lot of what therapy is, is building up your toolbox. And so that's where you get your sense of mastery, your sense of control over the world, is not by predicting, not by worrying. You try to do the things that are in your control, yes, but beyond that, what you say to yourself is, I know whatever it is, I will handle it because I have my toolbox with me. And so it's a different way of looking at control that people often don't think about, is looking at how we adapt is in our control. And that's an area that's 100% in our control.
Do you see any particular trends going on with so I wonder where this point about control comes from, though. Where along the way we as a societies or culture, or maybe it's been a global phenomena, that are people born with a sense of, I don't have as much control as I think I do? Or is it something that has to be taught and isn't being taught, and why isn't it being taught?
Well, I think that control is an innate need. I think there are just certain things that are innate, right? Survival types of needs that we have, such as need for connection, right? That's a survival need that we have to survive. And so I think that control is another one of those. I think needing to feel productive is a need. And there are certain needs that almost, every human being has, unless there's something neurologically going on that's preventing it. And so that's a place where we can all connect, where we can all relate with one another, is when you get down to needs, right? And that's one of the things that, I try to do, like in terms of communication and helping people, is to get down to the underlying needs, because that's something that we all share in common. But I do think that control is a need. And a lot of people say to me, oh, I'm a control freak, or I really need to feel in control. And I just say, yeah, you and everybody else on the planet. So
Yeah, and I remember this really good line. It was talking about how, I'm curious in terms of the needs thing. Is there like a shorthand list of things you can point to that are just like absolute? Because if you talk to a, like a 5-year-old kid, Dad, I need these Pokemon cards. Like, well, not really. But if a 35-year-old, 45, 55-year-old man says, like, I need somebody to just hug me, I'm like, well, okay, so then, like, where do we draw the line between Pokemon cards and a hug? And, like, what is an essential human need, or, like, a list of essential human needs versus common things people think they need or they don't actually need?
Well, that's where feelings come in, right? So let's take the Pokemon cards, for example. Okay. So what is the underlying need there for that child? It depends on, is it entertainment? Are they bored and that's why they like Pokemon cards? Is it, some sort of stimulation? Is it competition? Maybe they collect them and, whatever it is, right? So there's an underlying need there, feeling. And so what you would do is you would, start by trying to find out what is it that the child likes about Pokemon cards. How does collecting Pokemon cards make that child feel? I have a patient that is an adult now. He's in his 30s, and he just cherishes his Pokemon cards because he associates them with his childhood. But his childhood was very lonely, and so that was one of the things that he had control over, right? And where he could escape to. And so basically, once you get down to the feeling, that's what feelings represent. They represent a need or threat that we're overlooking. So once you get down to the feeling, then you can start looking at, are there other ways that this child can get the stimulation or the connection if they're lonely or whatever it is. It's really oftentimes what people do, and this gets back to society as a whole, is we apply solutions before we've even identified what the underlying need is. And so as a result, we really end up doing like a patchwork of solutions instead of starting with identifying what is the underlying need. And then, like I said, then problem solving from there. The solution should be the last thing, but oftentimes we come up with a solution first, right? Let's say gun control, for example, right? Gun control is a solution, right? Even abortion is a solution. What's the underlying problem? Unwanted pregnancy. And so what you want to do is you want to start by identifying what is the underlying problem first, and then what are the various solutions that you can apply to that. And so as a society, that's one of the things that I see a lot, is that, especially because politics, politics are, policy is very politics driven. And so we just sort of throw things at the problem. And there are think tanks out there that spend, that's what they do. That's all they do is research problems. And they have all kinds of good ideas, but, nobody ever takes those ideas from the ground up and applies them.
Yeah, there's a fantastic book. I think it's called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. And he basically talks about the different modes and the different pathways in your brain that you go about problem solving, and how, in general, when you have a complex problem to solve, your brain is utilizing more energy to solve it. But if it can be simplified, maybe like if you got the kitchen thing before, you've got a leak in your kitchen. Okay, maybe just change the pipes, and then that's the quick, simple solution. But it might actually be that like the entire piping system is messed up, in which case that's a complex problem to now solve. But the default tends to be people want to jump to the first simple solution they could find right off the bat, just because it's energetically easier. Probably because we're being attentionally taxed constantly throughout the day, where you have to keep up with everything on top of the day-to-day lives. And this is where something that becomes questions. People come through with problems and whatnot and ask me certain things, and like I'll say, like, what can I have, recently had a friend of mine who had digestive issues. And they're, what pill can I take? What can I do this? I'm like, how about just take everything away? Start simple. Like, reduce the complexity dramatically. Like, just do chicken and rice for like a week and see how you feel. Well, what about this stuff I found online? What about this diet? Like, just stop. Simple, 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 simple. Chicken and rice, see what happens, see how your body responds, and then build up from there. Because the more you try to layer complexity on top of complexity, the more you're going to look for quicker, simpler solutions to complex problems instead of trying to actually like deep dive into where these problems are coming from. And I think, especially in today's day and age, it's like if you can't answer the question in less than 15 seconds, then people don't want to listen anymore. And it's a massive problem. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Another solution is going back to something else that you brought up, which was when you were talking about, being on one of the social media sites for a long time, catching yourself, staying on for a long time. The way that you cope with it is the way most people cope is they talk to themselves negatively. And so we call this ruminating, right? And it usually falls into about 6 things that I find. It's either mind reading, second guessing yourself, anticipating somebody else's reactions, comparing yourself to others, self-criticizing, or overanalyzing. And I call all of those things chocolate cake. So get ready, because this is going to be probably off of what you're used to hearing. But all of the negative, the ways that we talk to ourselves, right, cognitively, is just a coping mechanism, right? And that's why I call it chocolate cake, because you might as well reach for chocolate cake. But instead of reaching for chocolate cake, what you do is you ruminate and you try to talk yourself out of your feelings and you analyze them or you anticipate, right? And so, again, I think that this happens because we don't talk about mental health, and people don't learn about emotional intelligence and why we have feelings. And so what I do with people is, they'll come to me with this complex problem, and I'll just say to them, okay, hold on, let's take a step back, right? What is the underlying feeling that you're having right now, right? Let's start there. That's where we really need to start. And then again, we have feelings in order to problem solve and in order to make good decisions. So we never have one feeling at a time, right? Most of the time we have mixed feelings. And so I always say chocolate versus vanilla ice cream, that's easy, but most things in life we have mixed feelings about. And so that's part of the way that we're meant to function. So at any given time, when you're trying to make a decision about something, or when you're shooting yourself or beating yourself up, what you need to do is stop and ask yourself, what are the different feelings that I'm having? And the solution needs to be something that balances all of those different needs. And it doesn't mean the solution is going to be all at once. Some part of the solution might be more long-term and some might short-term. But the bottom line is that, let's take your example. If you're on social media, what is it that you get out of that? Maybe it's a form of escape, right? So what is that possibly telling you about your life? Are you not consciously making a decision, to take a break or to spend some downtime, right? Because we often do that passively, right? That's why, procrastinate. And I'm just throwing that out as an example, right? So there's, wanting to get things done and there's wanting to have time to ourselves, and there's wanting to be, a responsible parent. And there's all these different feelings that we have at the same time. And if we ignore any of them, we're not going to feel happy, and we're also going to make bad decisions. When you follow just some of your feelings and ignore others, you make bad decisions. And so that's why it's so important to be in touch with your feelings, because when you're in touch with your feelings, you're proactive. You're saying, okay, I'm angry right now. How do I want to handle that anger? And let me think about all the other, things that I want right now besides just being angry or venting my anger or expressing myself, right? There's other needs that I have at the same time. So that's why I think of feelings as very practical.
Yeah, I recall this, I think it was like the 5-second rule from Mel Robbins, I think. And she talks about this idea, and this is an interesting point about emotions and I guess getting things done in life, is the 5-second rule basically say, like, if you have something you want to do and it's relatively simple, it's like, okay, I'm out on the bar, I see a really pretty girl over there, I want to go see and talk to her. Oh, anxiety's starting to come up and I'm nervous, and maybe what if she doesn't like me, what if this, what if that, what if that? And what you do basically recommends doing the same, like, just count down from 5 and just do it anyway. Like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hey, how's it going? My name's Mike. I just saw him across the way, and you're just like, oh, butterflies, all that stuff, and nervousness, and because the more you ruminate on it, the worse it's going to be.
Well, actually, I would take a very different approach.
Okay.
So you want to meet this person, right? At the same time, what are you afraid of? You're afraid of rejection, and that's normal. Rejection and failure, I believe, are normal human fears that everybody has, right? And so both of those things are important. We don't want to overlook that fear because it's valid. And that's what I do with my patients when it comes to anxiety. It's not about talking yourself out of anxiety. It's about learning from that anxiety. So then I would go, what is it specifically that you're afraid is going to happen? Are you afraid that she's just going to look at you and roll her eyes? You think she's going to throw a drink at you? I mean, what is it that you imagine is going to happen? And I do this little exercise I call worst case scenario, because usually our fears are much worse than the reality of the situation. But that fear is there and we have to face it. Face the beast. So look at it. And what I find is what people do is, number one, when they hear themselves talk about it, they go, wait a minute, does that sound realistic? But secondly, that's how you get into problem solving. So if you're afraid that, let's say you're afraid she's going to laugh at you or just like turn and look away from you, right? Okay. So then what? What is it that is in your control? Right? Now you could not go up to her, but then you're ignoring that other need that you have, which is wanting to be in a relationship, perhaps, wanting connections, right? So you can't ignore that either. So both things are important. So you might think about, what's a way that I might go up to her where I might where it's less likely that she's going to roll her eyes at me or ignore me or whatever, and so that's how you come up with a solution. And I'm mind you, that might sound like a lot of work to do, but once you get used to it, you get used to it and you do it. It's not really, doesn't take that much mental effort, but if you don't do that, if you just go with, ignore the anxiety, then you're right. That's what's going to happen. You're going to get more and more anxious. And then what happens? That anxiety could interfere with your performance, with your ability, to interact with this person. You might seem really nervous, or you might start stuttering, or you might say something awkward, right, that you didn't mean to say. So that's what I mean by our feelings are there to help us.
Yeah. And I was thinking, in a absolutely hypothetically perfect world, everybody on the day they were born, they'd be born, they'd come out, the placenta comes with it, the umbilical cord, and then there'd be a little instruction manual that says, like, this is my personality, and this is exactly what the kind of best of life I can live it could be. But the problem then becomes a lot of people trying to figure out what is their personality type and what kind of, and we talked earlier about different needs, and it varies a lot from people. Like, for example, personally, I love conversation one-on-one. I love talking to people, and I'm more agreeable than I am disagreeable. I don't like conflict if I can help it, but I'm not afraid to step in it if I need to. I have friends that are just like, I would get into a fight if I could every day. It's my favorite thing ever. I just love beating people up. It's the greatest thing ever. And then I have friends that are just like, if someone even think that someone might like me, I want to run for the hills. But you didn't learn that until you really went through life and did things. And I guess this may be part of what we're seeing in society today with especially younger kids. is ties into the whole thing you mentioned about like the anxiety of the approach is like the more you do it, the easier it gets. And the more, I suppose, the more you do it, the more you start to learn, oh, I'm an agreeable person, I'm a disagreeable person, I'm a hardworking person, I'm not really interested in working, 80 hours a week, or maybe I'm really interested in relationships. Maybe I really enjoy my alone time. Like, you don't know until you start to do it. But part of that doing it is getting over that initial anxiety and fear of the first couple times doing it. And I think one of the biggest things you see is people's own, I think it's the amygdala, is just on fire with like anxiety and fear about that first couple times of doing something and not realizing like, it's like when somebody goes to give a presentation on stage and they say like they've been doing it for a long time, they're a fantastic speaker, and people go, how do you do that? And the person's just like, I was just as nervous as you were the first time. I'm a human being. And actually this ties in nicely. I think that when it was you talked about in your blogs, it was same scene, different script, and the intolerance of human error, and the idea that people, I think maybe it's today more than ever, that people have this perception of if it's not perfect, then I must be doing something completely wrong. When in reality, everyone's going to screw up all the time.
Right. Well, perfectionism is another form of chocolate cake. It's a way for people to feel in control. And in control of what? Fear of failure or rejection. So again, I find that there are sort of three categories of anxiety or fear: fear of rejection, fear of failure, and fear of harm to self or others. Right. It's the first two that we tend to deal with on a daily basis. Now, what complicates things is you're talking about, how we're born and how we develop a sense of self. Well, that's where parents come in. That's why parents are so important. One of the roles of a parent is to be what we call a mirror or mirroring object for their kids. And that's how a child gets a sense of self. So when you think about the fact that so many people grow up in dysfunctional families and deal with trauma, that's going to disrupt that sense of self. And so what a lot of people end up doing is they start using other people as mirrors. And it's unconscious, but if you think about it, you may even catch yourself doing it. I know sometimes I do it too. I grew up in a dysfunctional family. What happens is that if you're using other people as mirrors for a sense of self, what are you going to do? You're going to bend over backwards to not disrupt that relationship. It might be a total stranger and you walk by and you smile at them and they don't smile back, and a lot of people can relate to that and say, oh my God, what is it? What's wrong with me? That's using people as mirrors for a sense of self. And so when we do that, that's when we tend to be like a perfectionist, again, mind reading, second guessing, criticizing ourselves. We are overcompensating because we're trying to avoid that rejection and failure, that negative mirroring. And so, we care about relationships. Yes, and we care about hurting people or disappointing people. But when somebody is disappointed or hurt, it also is unconsciously, we often see it as a reflection on ourselves as human beings, right? But what I tell people is that you never want to rely on other people as mirrors. When you go to a carnival and you see those warped mirrors, you have to think of people as carnival mirrors. And the reason why is because most people don't know how to manage their emotions and they don't know how to express them. And so a lot of times, we are motivated by emotion, but we don't express ourselves that way. We don't say, excuse me, but could you lower your voice? Because I'm trying to concentrate. You might say, God, you're such a loud person. Or you're so obnoxious, or you're, and we don't learn how to communicate our feelings, just like we don't know how to manage them. And so what I teach people is how to self-validate. So that doesn't mean that people don't have constructive feedback, but we're talking about who you are as a person, your sense of self. Nobody else can define your sense of self but you, your self-worth, right? Your competence, things like that, right? And so I teach people how to self-validate. And then, and there's two techniques that I teach with that. So the first one is what I call be your own best friend. And this is where embrace your humanity comes back in. Remember I said that we have innate skills. So people ask me, well, how do I self-validate? And I say, well, you already do it for everybody else, right? If you're talking to a child, for example, one of your children, right, and they came to you and said, well, I'm afraid of that somebody's not going to like me. Well, you don't say to them, well, if you're afraid of rejection and failure, here's what you do. You mind read, you second guess, you anticipate other people's reactions, you compare yourself to others, you self-criticize, right? And you realize, right, you wouldn't give that advice. What would you say? Normally, what do we say? We say, just be yourself. Don't worry about what other people think. You're good enough the way that you are, right? So when we're talking to ourselves, we're talking from a place of insecurity and fear and emotion mind. When we're talking to other people, particularly people we care about, we're talking from a place of reason mind and our values, how we treat other people. So that's what basically be your own best friend is anytime you catch yourself being hard on yourself, doing any of those things that I just listed, stop and ask yourself, number one, would I say this to somebody I care about? Would I say this to my child? Right? And if the answer is no, then ask yourself, what would I say to my child instead? And that's what you should be saying to yourself. And, people will say, well, that they're different. I'm different, I say, okay, well, if your child said, well, Mom, I get what you're saying, but I'm different. I need to be hard on myself. Would you agree with that? Of course not. So that's be your own best friend. And that's anytime you catch yourself being hard on yourself. Now, anytime somebody else makes you feel bad about yourself, then I apply the opposite of the golden rule. So you know what the golden rule is, right? Treat others the way you want to be treated. Well, the opposite of the golden rule is you have a right to be treated the way you treat other people. So if somebody's making you feel bad about yourself, ask yourself, if the situation reversed, would I be treating this person the same way? Would I be talking to them the way they're talking to me? And if the answer is no, well, then that tells you something, that what you're reacting to, what you're feeling, is not the feedback itself, but the way that they're handling it, the way that they're conveying that feedback. And so, and then you have a choice to make. Do you want to live your life, again, according to your values or according to that person's values? You can't necessarily change that person, but you can at least have perspective and say, I know that I don't treat people this way, not just this person, but all people. Whereas, that person, how they treat people may be different, but it has nothing to do with you because you know that you wouldn't handle it that way. So that's opposite of the golden rule.
I wonder though, it's a good point that you want to be your own best friend and you're good enough as you are. Where does that balance into you're good enough as you are, but if you push yourself, you could do better.
Mm-hmm.
And then there seems like two opposite sides of the spectrum where it's like you're good enough as you are, which means the world should bend to you. The opposite end of the spectrum is like you're never going to be good enough, and try as you might, it's always going to come up short. And somewhere, I guess maybe it's like more of like a flow back and forth. But it's like if you tell a kid who's struggling at playing some particular sport, like you're good enough as you are, you're doing good, but maybe he has a limited capacity or potential, and we wouldn't know unless we push him in that direction. There's this question of like, when maybe it's on a personal basis or on a friendly basis, like if somebody sees potential in you and wants to go about trying to pull it out of you and kind of say like, what you're doing is not okay, and I don't agree with it, and I think you can do better, and I'm going to try to show you how.
Right.
And I think maybe what people do nowadays, they drop up before they get to the last line of like,
right,
I'll try to help you get there because I know you could do it. It's almost like a little bruise your ego, like what the military does. We're going to break you, then build you back up again.
Right. Well, that's very different. We're not talking about the military. These tactics do not apply to the military. That's a whole nother culture, right?
Yeah.
And for good reason, right? We're talking about, saving people's lives and defending the country. But getting back to what you're saying, so what you're getting into is how we cope with our emotions. And, I talk about this in my 3 podcast episodes of parenting. One of the things that I always say is there's no such thing as a wrong or a bad feeling. It's how you cope with it that becomes the problem. And so, whatever the feeling is, right, you have to look at that. And again, depending on where that feeling is coming from, what is the underlying problem, right, that we need to solve here. So the feelings are only there to help us to go to the next step, which is to problem solve, right? And so one of the things that I tell parents is that, when you're working with your children, if they don't feel like getting up in the morning, they don't feel like doing their homework, or they're not motivated to do something. So the 2 things that are off the table are giving up and avoiding, because those aren't good coping skills, right, as a whole. And so you practice what we call tough love. That's what you're talking about, is tough love. Don't ask me to do something that's not in your best interest, because I won't do it. That's what tough love is, right? And I'll give you an example. My daughter, one time, there's a few things that I'm pretty strict about. Education is one of them. And so I wanted to see my daughter's something that she wrote for class, and she didn't want to show it to me. And so I said, we went back and forth a little bit, and then I said to her, well, Emily, are you going to take it out of your backpack, or am I? Right. So there was no third option of, giving into that, right? Because I know that's not in her best interest. So so she took it out of her backpack, crumpled it up in a ball, and threw it at me. And that's not my daughter at all. So I said, okay, I see you're angry. Okay. It's not okay to throw things, but I also know that wasn't my daughter. And then I opened it up and I read it, and it was really good. I don't know what she was hiding from. She was feeling self-conscious. I guess she was a teenager. But that's when you're dealing with that kind of stuff, resistance, the last thing you want to do is get in a power struggle with your child, because so I teach parents how to communicate in a way to avoid power struggles, and to problem solve together, and to teach them how to cope, and make good decisions. And that's why, that third part that we talk about is getting in touch with your feelings, problem solving. The third step is coping skills, teaching you lots of different coping skills. Right. And it gets back to my toolbox, right? It's really important.
I do massage therapy for a living, and I have a lot of patients who are teachers, and they've been teaching for a long time now, 20 plus years. And you're starting to see across the board this common theme, common thread of kids cannot cope with I'd say minimal, but simple things. It's like, it's understandable if you have a breakdown because a parent died, a grandparent died, your dog, your cat, something big happened in your house on fire. Like, take the day off. It's fine. We understand. That's a massive one. Absolutely. If you failed the math test, I don't think you need a personal sick day for that one thing, but it's a good thing to kind of say, like, okay, well, what you're feeling is okay. You should feel a little bit of like,
yeah,
I would say disgust, but like, distaste with yourself, saying like,
right,
I could have done better. If I wasn't staying up for 4 in the morning playing Call of Duty, if I wasn't staying looking at scrolling through Facebook, if I actually studied a couple more days, I could have done better. This feels gross, but I'm going to use this to then cope with it and do better next time.
Exactly. And that actually gets to, again, back to my embracing your humanity. There's nothing to be gained by judging yourself or beating yourself up. You just learn from your mistakes. And I call that being Columbo without the trench coat and cigar. If you're familiar with that 70s detective show, Columbo, right? Peter Falk. He used to walk around with this crumpled or rumpled trench coat and a cigar in his hand all the time. And so that's what we want to do. We want to be compassionately curious. So if you fail the test, the thing to do is not to say, well, what, you're stupid or you're lazy or, or call yourself names or, or shoulda, coulda, woulda, but to say, okay, what can I learn from this, right? What can I do differently next time? What went well? What didn't go well, right? That's how you improve, Right. And again, that's what I mean by embracing your humanity. There's nothing to be gained by beating yourself up. It goes back to what we were talking about before, about the whole chocolate cake and, all of that ruminating. That's not how you change. How you change is by problem solving and then doing. So, sitting there and beating yourself up or worrying doesn't accomplish anything.
Have you noticed a trend with a lot of parents? I've heard this before, where parents are trying too hard nowadays to be their kid's friend instead of their parents.
I can't say that I've noticed that myself in my work, and I work with kids, and I work with all ages. So, but what are you thinking in that respect?
Well,
What have
and
you
you mentioned
seen?
before with your daughter and the crumpled essay and things she wrote up. Like a friend would say, might lean more towards, all right, you know what, it's probably a crappy essay. If you don't want to show me, it's okay. I don't want to push that emotional boundary too much. Whereas as your mother, her mother, you basically said, like, right now, I'm not your friend. I'm trying to be someone trying to see the best in you. And you're going to hate me for that temporarily, but afterwards, once we improve on it, you're going to thank me. And I think using a trend, at least I've noticed here and there, a lot of parents are basically saying, like, I don't want to make my kids feel upset with me because I'm afraid of their own emotional backlash. It's going to hurt me. And more often than not, I think what we've seen through time is that when parents try to be their friends early on, you needed a parent, and then they end up like the problems later on in life because they didn't have that kind of structure and discipline needed to push them through those learning opportunities. Versus when you reverse it, like I'm your parent when you're a kid, and then when you're an adult, we'll be friends.
Right. No, I agree. It's actually kind of ironic. Once you went back to that example, I thought about, my ex-husband. We have a really good relationship. In fact, people say we have the nicest divorce they've ever seen. So we work together really well, but we do have some differences, and that's one of them. If my daughter, doesn't want him to see something, then he'll give in to that. And we've had conversations about that, so I don't want to make her uncomfortable. There was a really good example of this. So one year, she took a summer job working at one of these old historic sites where she was a costume interpreter. And I wanted to go see her, towards the end of the season. I wanted to go see her and watch her in action. And I got into this long disagreement with my ex-husband about doing that. It's going to make her uncomfortable, I was like, well, if it makes her uncomfortable, it makes her uncomfortable, but it shouldn't make her uncomfortable. That's the point. And so we have to look at that. If it makes her uncomfortable, where is that coming from? That's coming from a place of self-consciousness. What is it she's afraid of, right? That's a feeling that I want to help her to overcome. If she's feeling self-conscious, what is it that she's afraid is going to happen? Is she afraid I'm going to embarrass her? Is she afraid that, I don't know, she's going to not know what to do, forget everything that she's learned. I mean, I'm her mother, so whatever, whatever it is, it is. So, so I went. He didn't. I went, and she was phenomenal. She was assigned that day. She was at this Indian encampment or Native American encampment. And she took me around. It was just us. There was nobody else there visiting. She took me around and she showed me all these different things. And I asked questions, and I did not hold back. I asked questions that I would normally ask, someone. And I like to ask a lot of questions because I like to learn. And she was right on top of it. She knew all of the answers. And it was just, I was so impressed. And I was obviously glad that I did it. And so, again, there's nothing wrong with the feeling of being self-conscious, but it's how you cope with it. And giving in, right? Like giving up or avoiding is not a good way of coping, because there are going to be many times in your life. This is what I explain to parents and what they need to explain to their children. It's not about homework. It's not about public speaking. It's about all the times that you have that feeling, that same feeling. And if you don't learn how to cope with that feeling, then you're going to cope with it by avoiding or giving up, because that's the way you learn to cope with it. So this is about life.
You notice, I don't want to like poke your ex-husband too much, I definitely can resonate with that feeling of, oh, we're going to embarrass him, or oh, this is going to be weird, or like my feelings are or projecting, I guess is the word.
Right.
That like, is that a common theme with certain types of people, or certain types of backgrounds, maybe a home life upbringing or culture, environment, where people tend to overly project a certain emotional state onto the surroundings and certain outcomes to the point that it inhibits them from actually moving forward with the activity. I think this term I've heard before is referred to as playing it through to the end, where it's like you said before, it's just like, what's the worst thing that happens? Well, she gets a little flustered and embarrassed. It's not like she's going to like get fired and all of a sudden she's just going to like explode or something crazy. But your mind over emphasizes what could happen. But I wonder, is that a function of personality or a function of environment and society and upbringing, or maybe a combination of both? Because in most cases, I don't think it's necessarily your anxiety or your fear gets lower. It's more that your confidence just exceeds it with practice and time.
Right. Well, it's really complicated. First of all, you mentioned the amygdala. So the amygdala only learns by doing, by experience. You can't talk your amygdala out of feeling fearful. Yeah. So that's why, and it's so cool when you learn about things about your brain and you're like, and then you think about when they tell you got to get outside your comfort zone, that's why that works. That's why that cliche matters, because that's the way that your brain learns, is if you don't get outside your comfort zone, you don't experience something different, you're going to continue to have that same fear reaction. I also think that, anxiety disorders are real and they run in families. And so, when I work with people, we always start with, therapy. But sometimes we find that, that we need more than that, they've learned all these great skills and they're trying their best. And the anxiety is just not manageable with coping skills alone. And that's where medication can play a role. So there's that piece of it. And, as far as personality goes, sure, there are definitely certain types of personality that generate more anxiety. But the one thing that I do differently is I don't approach anxiety, regardless of how extreme it is or how excessive it is. I don't treat it as like the enemy. I start with, your anxiety is trying to tell you something. Let's try to learn from it. And then gradually, take a step back and get stronger and stronger, So I think that there's always, that's the thing about anxiety, is there's always that little grain of truth, and which is why it's hard for people to talk themselves out of it. It's like you said, I know that I'm not going to explode, right? I know that, purple men from Mars aren't going to come down and invade the world, right? And so even with crossing bridges, is there a possibility a bridge could collapse? Sure. There's always that little grain of truth. And if you challenge people's thoughts, then you're going to get caught into just validating that way of coping, the ruminating as a way of coping with that anxiety. So that's why I just don't even go there. I just start with, what are you feeling? Where is this coming from? What's in your control?
Like that, yeah. I had a friend, this I guess ties into like the nature versus nurture thing in terms of all this anxiety and whatnot. He had I think when he was 6 weeks old, I think he had meningitis. It's crazy. And I know he's had a bit of lifelong anxiety, I think, as a result, almost like his nervous system is over functioning because during his developmental years, there were a lot of problems in this. But I wonder in that same capacity, to what degree certain, maybe there's research around if I could find it in the future, around certain anxieties and disorders. When you said generationally, they're maybe genetic, but they may also be family-based. But then in the same capacity that a lot of trauma tends to be multi-generationally, multi-family-based.
Well, that's true too. Trauma will definitely create anxiety.
Yeah, where you have a family that has like a history of like, the grandfather was an alcoholic and he beat his child. Now he became an alcoholic because he's dealing with the problem of his grandfather growing up. So now he's beating his child. And now like, it's just alcohol runs into the family. And it's like, well, the propensity for alcoholism might run into the family, but Does that mean that you have to be an alcoholic? Do you have, or anxiety and things like that? Like, does it mean you like have to be? Where I guess the disorder, depends on how extreme it is, depending on what the outline
Right.
is.
Right.
And
Yeah, particularly with certain types of disorders like obsessive compulsive. That one is, I mean, it's very hard. I have in certain cases, mild cases, I have been able to just use therapy. You really need to a combination of medication and therapy to manage it. Same with depression. Right.
Yeah, I've seen this in the capacity of I've talked to people with like certain family issues or this and that, where there's a combination of the two depending on what it is. I wonder though. Then I'm talking to a friend of mine next week who's also a therapist, and this concept of pop psychology, where you said OCD, for example, and people will say, "Oh, my shoes are a little to the left. That's my OCD. Oh, I didn't do the dishes. That's my OCD." In reality, it's like I don't think you've actually seen real OCD. Like real OCD is debilitating, or true ADD. Like, oh, I'm just so scatterbrained, so ADD. Like no. ADD, ADHD. That's a completely different level of what you're thinking. But then to piggyback of that, people then have this problem, especially in America, where every other advertising on TV is a drug commercial, where people think like, I'm slightly scatterbrained. I must be ADD. Oh, I'm a little bit neurotic about the place being clean. I must be OCD. Or I had indigestion the other day. I must have diverticulitis or something like that. And the question then becomes like this point of overdiagnosing problems based on small symptoms. Where in your case, you said like we were actually able to manage mild OCD with therapy and maybe a little bit of medication, but it wasn't permanent. We got them to kind of like walk off that ledge. Where a lot of people now are kind of leaning towards like ties back into the locus of control thing, where it's like, well, it has to be OCD, and OCD is out of my control, so I have to take this medication forever instead of actually working on it.
Right. Well, this one was very situational specific because she, was a young mother and she was worried about, her daughter getting sick, so she became kind of OCD-ish about, that sort of thing. I mean, it definitely fit the definition of it, but, it also, I think it depends sometimes on, how, some people just take to therapy better than others. But, this is always really tricky, the whole medication thing, right? Because I don't like to go one extreme or the other. But I will tell you this, because people come to me for therapy, most of the time I see people who aren't really keen on medication. That's why they're coming to me, right? They're not going straight to their primary care physician. And so I've had a lot of patients over the years who were against medication. And, I always say I respect that. I always want to try psychotherapy first anyway and see how that works. But I can tell you that in those cases, a lot of them, after we've worked together for a while, will come back and say to me, I want to try medication. And every single one of those people that have done that, they have said to me, I wish I had tried this sooner. And so now I tell people that story. I say, I respect that, but I just want you to know that this is, just so you know. And to keep in mind that you don't know what you don't know. Like people who, when you struggle with depression or anxiety, you don't know what it feels like not to be depressed or anxious. At least to that degree. And so, sometimes you have to try it and see how you feel on it. And I think that's what happened to these people. They didn't know what they didn't know. And so once they tried it and they realized, oh my God, this is what it feels like to be normal, So that's what, I tell people is, sometimes maybe it's, not right away, never, right away. I always say, let's try therapy. But, if you have this hard and fast rule, like I don't even try Tylenol. So, that's the kind of thing. I've had a lot of patients like that, to at least keep an open mind in that respect. And then I also explain to them how the medications work. These are not mood-altering drugs. They don't work the way marijuana works, right? Or so other illicit drugs. So, a lot of times people don't understand that these are drugs that work over time because and for various reasons, we know about the neurotransmitters and how they block the breakdown of neurotransmitters. So, but there's other things that cause, the anxiety and depression. We're still learning about the brain. So
have you noticed any differences, I guess, in terms of the coping and treatment methodologies that men versus women go through? There's a fantastic book I read recently. It was called I Don't Want to Talk About It. And it was a book about male depression and how men are notorious for basically. I found myself in my own past, looking back, where I was like, oh, I totally did that. Wow. Where you just drown yourself in work or maybe not substances in my case, but like something I could be practicing an instrument. I play piano sometimes, or I'm working my butt off, and you don't realize what you're doing subconsciously is trying to just like push away the boredom, because behind the boredom is the depression that you haven't been dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
And I've noticed, I guess I'm wondering, especially there's a big topic going on now in a lot of mental health circles, especially online, talking about how traditional therapy, on average, is not as effective for men as it is for women.
Right. And there is a chronic low-grade depression that often goes undiagnosed. It used to be called dysthymia, but now we just put it under major depression. But it's very mild, and if you experience like getting overwhelmed really easily, or generalized anxiety, not panic, but more like worrying type of thing, and you do that a lot. If you're quick to cry, you're very emotional in that respect, those can be some signs that you might have this low-grade depression. And so, and there are ways of managing it. But what I find, yes, is women much more comfortable coming to therapy than men are. And I attribute that to our culture.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of pressure put on men to not talk about feelings, not show your feelings, right? That's for sissies, kind of thing. And in fact, oftentimes when men do come in, it's often like couples counseling, because they're coming in for that. And what often happens is the wife, the spouse or the partner, has to drag him in. He doesn't want to come. And so I have learned how to, say, encourage, entice men to come into counseling, because a lot of times they'll say no when the wife wants them to. So I have this model, 15 principles of communication. And what I'll do is I will go through them. And so what I tell my patient is to tell your husband that I have these principles of communication. They're communication skills, right? That I teach couples, and, I'm more than happy to teach them to you. And so, then that's a lot less threatening. It's psychoeducational. It's not therapy. I think sometimes they feel like they're going to be, ganged up on, right? Or, forced to talk about things and it's uncomfortable. And so they get their feet wet and they always come back. I always have success with that. The principles themselves, the reason I call them principles is because they're not really skills. Most of them talk about understanding the way we communicate is based on, how we interact with one another. What is going on under the surface, that kind of what we call psychodynamics, or just the way people relate or interact with one another, and how that influences how we respond to each other. And so what I do is I teach them basically the context, when this happens, or, when that happens, this is what's going on, and this is why it's going on. This is why it's happening. And so once you have that context, then you know what to do with it. You know how to respond to it better.
Yeah, I remember hearing about this thing. It was really interesting. I guess this maybe ties back. I think we mentioned this earlier in the conversation. It's something, I think it's going on in Australia. It's called the SHED Initiative. And it's something like what they're doing is they're popping up these almost like a shed in your backyard. And they're like these locations that men can go to, and they can bring something of theirs. It's their car, it's their lawnmower, it's their weed whacker, it's something in the house that's broken. and needs to be fixed. And other men just happen to congregate there, and then they'll work together to fix it. So in the problem of fixing it, they'll just, they'll have like a screwdriver. Like, all right, this guy's got a screwdriver, this guy's got a sledgehammer, this guy's got that. Okay, so all right, so just gotta make sure the screws are tight over here. We gotta do this over here. And oh god, my wife's been driving me nuts. Like, I gotta tell you, my kids. I'm just make sure the chain link is tight there. Like, I haven't talked to my boss. I want to kill my boss. I swear to God. And also, while they're doing something, now all of a sudden they're talking. And I think it's something we've lost. Like my father, when I was growing up, he used to do a bowling league every week. And looking back, I realized like that was his guy time. That was his therapy. Was like going with other men to go generally do an activity with some degree of competition. Maybe because men are generally a little more competitive on average than women might be. Not always, but in certain circumstances. But like how that tied into the form of therapy, where it was like. Maybe you notice with men too. It's like they'll come in and talk about their feelings and say, "Okay, so what's the solution? What do we do about it? What's the actions I can take?" Because I don't want to talk forever. I want to actually start doing something.
Right. They are more cognitive oriented for sure. But I'm psychodynamically oriented, so I'm insight oriented, and that's what sort of guides my interventions. But then I'm, as you can see, I'm very practical. So, I get my understanding from the psychodynamics, but then I try to find practical applications because I think that's what people need. They want something that's easy to remember and understand and apply. And so that's why I call them my mantras. I have a ton of those, 3-step strategies, idioms and analogies that I use. The toolbox, for example, that's just one example of them.
So in that case, it ties back to that discussion about like what is your personality, what works best for you in terms of how you problem solve in the best kind of life. What are your needs and how do you go about achieving those needs? And not everybody's needs is going to be exactly the same.
Right.
It's going to be
a good therapist will be eclectic and will shape their interventions according to not just the person, but the presenting problem that they're bringing in. I do think that men feel more comfortable talking to women. You might think that, they want a male therapist, but I think they're more comfortable talking to a female therapist because I think they're more comfortable talking to women about their feelings than they are other guys. So that's been my experience too.
Yeah, I can see that a point of vulnerability, I guess, other men. I've noticed this even with my massage work where as a male massage therapist, I'm a little bit of an outlier. That most massage therapists tend to lean toward. Most women want to work with women. Most men are feeling weird having a guy touch them, so they want to work with a woman. But my personality tends to gravitate really well, and I've had a number of stories where guys will come in and they're like, "Just so you know, I never had a guy touch me before. I'm not into that kind of thing, but I'm just here. I'm like, I'm not gonna do anything weird. I promise. I'm just gonna rub your back and work out your nuts." And then afterwards, they're like,
"That is a challenge.
Why I hesitated." Yeah,
that's a very interesting profession to be a male, and I could see that where as a woman I'm not sure I would feel comfortable with a guy, even a gynecologist, male gynecologist, so it's one of those things where that's an interesting. So you really have to use your skills, your personality skills, your personability, right, to make people feel comfortable.
It's a big one, and I don't know if this is a personal skill that I was just born with, that I have intrinsically, or something I developed to practice some time, but like reading body language, and I guess that ties into the social media problem, is that I'll have so many times people come in, and maybe like their hand is like laying down on the table next to them, and they're just working as hard as they can while I'm working on their back. I'm like, how you feeling? I'm fine. Everything's totally fine. It's totally good. Yeah, I'm good. I'm like, okay. Take a deep breath. Like, relax the hand. I'm not like, let's dial it back a few notches. I don't need to go as deep as I'm going because clearly your body can't handle it right now, and that's okay. No. You keep. I could take it. I could take it. Like, it's not about you being able to take it. It's about what your body can tolerate right now, and you're not a weak person because you didn't get the ultra soul crushing deep elbow of death of whatever you want to call it into your back. You couldn't handle it. But a lot of times people just they either have that, and I also have on the flip side reading people's emotional states, and it's all I just had a really good experience with that. I'll never forget. I had this one woman. Her husband had an open heart surgery. And he was on medications, and he was on recovery and antibiotics, and they had 2 kids together. But I think it was like 2 boys. Like one was like 6, and one was like 8 or 9 years old. And she'd been to me a couple times, and she came in, and okay, how you doing today? I'm good. Oh, one word answers. Okay. How are you feeling? Fine. How's your husband doing? Good. Okay. So, but like I could see, like she was just like doing everything she could to just bottle it up. I don't want to let it out. And I never make a point to say, like, I can obviously see you're having problems that you need to talk about right now. Because I never.
Right.
And so I was working on.
I would do that.
Well, I was working on her shoulders, and I could feel some tension. I'm like, okay, this might be an avenue to try to pull this door open. And I said, well, your shoulders feel kind of tight. Just, how's your stress been? She took a deep breath and started hysterical crying for like 30, 40 seconds. And then she's talking, oh my God, it's been so stressful. My husband has been driving me nuts. It's been able to work, and the kids drive me nuts. I'm just like, I have to keep talking, just keep letting it out. And then like 3 minutes later, she's like, oh my God, I feel 10 times better. Like I was wanting to be like, well, yeah, I know. I walked into that. You need to uncork that bottle. But I had to do it in such a way that as you feel comfortable doing it. If you don't want to let it out with me at the same time, totally fine. But if I can encourage you to just decompress and vent a little bit, it's amazing how much your body will then respond to that and calm down too.
That actually is a good place to end. You know, no matter with therapy, no matter what modality you use, what matters most is the relationship that the therapist has with the patient. I say it's the relationship stupid, right? So that's the best predictor for successful therapy is not the certain modality, but the relationship. And so you're kind of talking about the same thing. It's that relationship.
Thank you for joining us today. If you found us informative, thought-provoking, or learned something new, please leave a review or a comment and tell a friend about the podcast. Feedback means the world to me, as I want to make this the best possible podcast that it can be, and to help others identify the causes of and solutions to problems in their own lives and villages. Until next time, let's keep working on rebuilding the village.